when Stalingrad was just a name on a map. The cold was not just biting, it was suffocating. It crept into the bones, into the soul, and into the hearts of men who no longer remembered what warmth meant. In the winter of 1942, the Eastern Front was not just a battlefield. It was a frozen purgatory, stretching from the forests of Belarus to the Volga River, swallowing men, machines, and entire divisions whole. The snow fell not as a gentle veil, but like ash from a dying sky, and beneath it, the might of two empires prepared to collide in what would become one of the deadliest confrontations in human history. But Stalingrad, that name drenched in blood and myth today, was not always a battlefield. Not yet. In the early months of 1942, Adolf Hitler found himself confronting a strategic nightmare. His dream of a swift victory in the Soviet Union, blitzkrieg across the steppes, the fall of Moscow by Christmas, had failed. The Wehrmacht had stalled in the mud and snow outside the Soviet capital, suffering its first major setback. The Red Army had proven more resilient than anyone in Berlin had expected. Germany's lightning war was beginning to flicker. Faced with mounting casualties, an overstretched supply line, and a war that was no longer quick nor clean, Hitler changed direction. If he could not take Moscow, he would shift south, to the Caucasus, to the oil fields of Baku, to the resources that could sustain the German war machine for years. The campaign was given a name: Operation Blau, Operation Blue. But oil wasn't the only target. Sitting along the banks of the Volga River was a city that bore the name of Hitler's greatest ideological enemy: Stalin, Stalingrad. To Hitler, capturing the city was not just about cutting off Soviet supply routes. It was about crushing morale, about proving that even the heart of the Soviet Union, the very name of its leader, could be desecrated and reduced to rubble. It would be a trophy, a symbol, and a message to the world. To Stalin, the city was more than a name. It was a line in the sand. Losing Stalingrad would mean losing face, not just politically, but psychologically. It would echo throughout the motherland as a symbol of failure. And so the order was simple: not one step back. The defense of the city would be total, no retreat, no surrender. Thus began the slow, inevitable spiral into hell. No one, not Hitler, not Stalin, not the generals, nor the soldiers, fully understood what Stalingrad would become. They did not know they were stepping into the mouth of a monster. That this city, with its factories and riverbanks, its tram lines and working-class neighborhoods, would become a graveyard for hundreds of thousands. That it would be reduced, brick by brick, to a charnel house of frost, flame, and blood. The question, even now, remains: was Stalingrad the turning point that saved the world from Nazi domination, or was it merely a deeper descent into the madness of total war? Two armies, two worlds, and a snowbound fate awaiting them. Before the shooting began, before the rubble and ash, there was still time to believe that this war might end before the river froze. In the summer of 1942, as the winds of Operation Blau gathered force, two armies marched toward a city neither of them truly understood, and neither would leave unchanged. The Wehrmacht, efficiency, discipline, and a fractured illusion. The German Sixth Army, under the command of General Paulus, was considered the most powerful field army in Europe. Hardened by years of victories across Poland, France, and the early phases of the Eastern Campaign, its soldiers carried an aura of invincibility. But that confidence was not absolute. Behind the polished discipline lay growing fractures, fatigue, frostbite, and a creeping realization that the Eastern Front was unlike anything they had faced before. The vastness, the people, the cold, and now the long supply lines and the endless resistance from an enemy that refused to collapse. General Paulus, a methodical and deeply obedient commander, had risen not through daring, but through structure, a man of staff, more than battlefield instinct. He was handed the task of taking Stalingrad, but with unclear objectives. Was it to secure the flank, destroy Soviet industry, or simply claim the city for its name? His soldiers would soon learn that the path to Stalingrad was not a parade. It was a graveyard. The Red Army, broken, brutalized, and unyielding. On the other side, the Red Army was a paradox, disorganized yet unbreakable, devastated by purges, yet fueled by vengeance. The man tasked with organizing its counteroffensive was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most capable military mind. Blunt, ruthless, and pragmatic, Zhukov understood Stalin better than most, and feared him no less than the enemy. Within the city itself, General Vasily Chuikov would lead the 62nd Army, a unit cobbled together from fragments, reservists, and raw recruits. Chuikov was not elegant. He was not gentle. He led with fists, rage, and the constant belief that retreat was a death sentence. "We will fight in every room," he declared, "in every staircase, and if we must, with our fists and teeth." For Soviet soldiers, the war was personal. This was their land, their homes, their mothers and children at risk. And yet, terror also came from within. Stalin's Order Number 2227, issued just weeks before, echoed like a funeral bell. Not one step back. Any retreat would be punished. Cowards were executed. Fear was a weapon. And it came from both directions. Inside the mind of a soldier, the German soldier marched with discipline and training, but also a growing sense of confusion. Weren't the Russians supposed to break? Why did they keep fighting in hopeless situations? Why did this land seem to absorb even the most crushing blows? He believed in Hitler's promises, at least at first, but as the snow thickened and bodies froze beside railcars, questions crept in. The Soviet soldier, often poorly equipped and barely trained, fought with the desperation of someone with nowhere left to run. He believed, or was made to believe, in the sanctity of Mother Russia, in the righteousness of the communist future. But more than that, he feared shame. He feared being labeled a traitor, and above all, he feared disappearing in the night, not at the hands of the enemy, but his own officers. Rations, propaganda, and the machinery of obedience daily life on both sides was a study in contrast and convergence. The Wehrmacht dined on carefully calculated rations, canned meat, ersatz coffee, stale bread. Officers enjoyed marginally better fare for now. Morale was sustained by Nazi propaganda, which declared Soviet resistance a dying gasp. Maps hung in command tents showed a clear path to the Volga. Victory was imminent, they said. In Soviet trenches and cellars, the story was different. Bread was measured by grams. Soup was often just boiled water. Meat was rare. Cigarettes, more valuable than bullets, became currency. Propaganda was relentless. Posters, songs, and loudspeakers repeated slogans about heroism, duty, and the invincibility of socialism. Deserters were hanged in public as warnings. Letters from home were censored. Hope was rationed more tightly than food. And yet, both sides endured. Stalingrad before the storm, before the bombs fell, before factories became fortresses, Stalingrad was a city of ambition. It had grown rapidly under Stalin's industrialization push, its skyline dominated by smokestacks and its streets filled with workers, trams, and students. The Volga shimmered in the summer sun, and orchestras played at open-air theaters. It was a city of promise, built from concrete and ideology. Now, the people were digging trenches in their own gardens. Schoolboys carried rifles. Women joined militias. Entire factories retooled overnight to produce ammunition instead of machinery. Workers didn't flee. They kept working as the walls around them shook from artillery. Because this was not just about land, not just about oil or maps or pride, it was about the soul of two worlds. And both were marching blindly, stubbornly, fatally toward the frozen jaws of history. Every brick, every room, every blade of grass became a battlefield. You didn't advance by kilometers in Stalingrad. You advanced by inches, and sometimes not even that. The city that bore Stalin's name, once a symbol of Soviet industrial power, had become something else entirely. It was no longer a city, it was a ruin. A maze of collapsed buildings, scorched walls, and shattered glass. And every inch of it mattered. In Stalingrad, the front line had no clear shape. It twisted through bombed-out factories, snaked along sewer tunnels, and climbed staircases where men fought hand-to-hand for the control of a single floor. Snipers ruled from shadows. Machine gunners dug into rubble. Grenades were tossed from one room to the next like greetings from hell. Urban combat at the edge of sanity. This was not war as strategists imagined. This was close-quarter butchery, a form of combat where men could hear the breathing of their enemy through the wall, where one unit might hold the kitchen and the enemy the bedroom, separated only by a collapsed hallway and sheer madness. Entire regiments perished, fighting over places like the grain elevator, a towering complex that became a fortress, holding for days against relentless German assault. The Red October factory, where steelworkers turned soldiers and machine tools were swapped for rifles. Pavlov's house, an apartment building defended by a handful of Soviet troops for nearly 2 months, turned into a symbol of unbreakable resistance. Germans dubbed it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, because that's what it felt like. Crawling through basements, clawing through shattered bricks, no safety, no silence, no reprieve. What it meant to be a soldier in Stalingrad. For a German infantryman, the initial weeks of the offensive had felt like progress. Streets were taken, enemy lines fell. But soon, everything slowed. Ammunition dwindled. Cold crept into boots and minds. Orders came, but clarity did not. The enemy would not die. They disappeared, returned, counterattacked in the night. He wrote home, less often now. What could he say? That his comrade was buried under rubble, unreachable? That he hadn't eaten in 2 days and was now chewing old leather for relief? That he had begun to see shadows as ghosts and ghosts as friends? Meanwhile, for a Red Army conscript, the days bled together in a haze of blood and ice. His rifle was second-hand, with scratches from a man who no longer lived. His boots were too big. He had learned to stop hoping for hot food, or letters, or sleep. He had stopped thinking about surviving the war. Now, he only thought of surviving the day, the hour, the next corner, when he crouched behind a broken piano in a burnt-out schoolroom. Hearing boots upstairs, he didn't think of communism, or Stalin, or the motherland. He thought of how to stay alive 5 more minutes. Winter, the third and cruelest force. And then came the winter. Not the cold of a December morning in Berlin. Not the snow of a postcard, but a Siberian monster sweeping in from the east with temperatures that turned flesh to stone. 40 degrees below zero. Metal shattered, guns jammed, fuel froze in barrels. Soldiers woke with ice in their beards, and fingers blackened with frostbite. Some simply didn't wake up at all. They died in their sleep, curled beside furnaces that no longer burned. And yet the battle did not stop, because it couldn't. Firefights broke out in alleys, coated in snow, bullets tearing through walls already broken by artillery. Airstrikes fell on both sides of the river, the roar of engines above, now more terrifying than inspiring. Hospitals were overrun, trenches overflowed with the dead. Dogs and rats disappeared, eaten. Soldiers stripped the dead for boots, for coats, for warmth. The Volga froze. Supplies dwindled, communications broke, and still, commanders demanded advances. Still, the killing continued. A city consumed by fire and ice. There was no longer a front line. There was only survival, only madness. Some buildings changed hands 15 times. Some soldiers never saw the sun for weeks, crawling through tunnels, living on scraps. And in this frozen hell, every man lost something by a friend, a limb, his mind. But what none of them knew was that this was just the midpoint. The worst had yet to come. No glory left, only ice and screams. They no longer screamed when they died. The cold had stolen even that. By the end of November 1942, Stalingrad was no longer just a battle, it was a slow-motion catastrophe, an implosion of bodies, sanity, and structure. Every street was a cemetery, every basement a morgue, every breath a gamble. The city didn't fall. It sank into hunger, disease, madness, and silence. The price paid in flesh and fire, neither side kept accurate counts. They couldn't. The numbers were too vast. The dead too scattered, buried under rubble or ice. Estimates suggest over 2 million men, women, and children were caught in the meat grinder that was Stalingrad. The living envied the dead. Soldiers boiled leather belts for soup. Horses, when they could be found, were butchered on the spot. Some resorted to things darker, spoken only in whispers, later denied, never forgotten. Bandages were cut from old shirts, crusted with dried blood. Painkillers were a fantasy. Wounded men lay on wooden pallets, screaming into their own sleeves. Nurses had no morphine. Surgeons operated with gloves frozen to their hands. And outside, the snow fell endlessly, beautiful, indifferent, suffocating. Diseases with no names, wounds with no time to heal. In makeshift shelters, cellars, train stations, abandoned trams, disease ran free. Dysentery, typhus, frostbite, pneumonia. But more lethal than any virus was despair. Some men spoke to ghosts. Others dug holes for themselves and simply lay down in them. The line between sanity and survival blurred by the hour. For the German Sixth Army, the collapse began not with enemy fire, but with silence, when the radios stopped replying, when promised supplies never came, when "hold your position" became an echo in a frozen grave. Their encirclement had a name: Operation Uranus, a masterstroke by the Red Army that closed the iron jaws around Paulus and 300,000 men. The Wehrmacht had been turned from hunter to hunted, trapped in a city with no way out. Inside the pocket, the Kessel, German soldiers began to understand what fate had in store. There would be no retreat, no rescue. Hitler had declared, "The Sixth Army will stand fast." Paulus obeyed, not because he believed, but because he had no choice. The Luftwaffe promised resupply, but the airfields were frozen, planes were few, the cold warped mechanics, parachutes dropped into Soviet hands, food spoiled before it touched the ground. And so the men huddled, wrapped in curtains, newspaper, pieces of tarp. Boots were shared, socks stolen, letters from home read over and over like prayers. Some still hoped, others stopped hoping. Because how do you escape when even the snow is your enemy? The cold, Stalin's most ruthless general, the Soviet winter didn't take sides. It just killed slower than bullets. But for the Red Army, it was an ally, a cruel, perfect ally. Soviet troops were better prepared, marginally. They had fur-lined jackets, thicker boots, more experience. But not enough. Not really. Still, they endured. They always had. Inside their minds, the war was not just survival. It was revenge, for villages burned, families slaughtered, for humiliation. The propaganda machine roared, leaflets fluttered from planes, radios screamed of fascist death, songs of heroism played through tin speakers wired along frozen streets. Hold Stalingrad was no longer an order, it was religion. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, Goebbels' newspapers proclaimed imminent victory. Frontline news was carefully selected, rewritten, reimagined. We are advancing steadily. The Soviet lines are breaking. In reality, the lines had already closed. And in Moscow, Stalin stayed silent. Let the frost speak. Let the city crush them. Let the myth of invincibility freeze and rot beside their steel helmets. The echoes of the forgotten. For the soldiers of the Sixth Army, December brought no joy, no holidays, just hunger, just snow. They began to realize they had been left to die. Some blamed Paulus, others cursed Hitler. Some simply stared into the middle distance, too cold to cry, too empty to pray. In one ruined building, a German soldier scribbled in a diary, "They told us we were heroes, but heroes don't die in cellars, choking on their own blood." He died the next day. And outside, the city waited, not for surrender, but for silence. Stalingrad, where history buried a grand delusion. Not every empire ends in flames. Some are extinguished by frost, silence, and the weight of their own lies. When the final shots faded over the frozen ruins of Stalingrad in February 1943, the world had shifted. The city was rubble, but it had become sacred ground, not for its triumph, but for what it destroyed: the myth of Nazi invincibility. The military lessons, carved in ice and ash. From a strategic standpoint, Stalingrad rewrote the rules of modern warfare. For Germany, it was a lesson in arrogance, a warning that ideology cannot overwrite logistics, that maps do not equal terrain. Overextension, poor supply chains, and blind obedience to a delusional high command, these factors crippled the Wehrmacht long before the Soviets closed the trap. Paulus, once the symbol of calculated German efficiency, surrendered in a gesture as historic as it was humiliating. For the first time, a German field marshal had capitulated in battle, and it broke something deep within the Nazi war machine. From this moment on, the German army would never again regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. They had reached their high water mark, and the tide began to turn. For the Soviets, the lessons were forged through agony and fire, resilience, improvisation, urban defense, and the use of terrain and weather as weapons. But more than tactics, Stalingrad gave the Red Army something far more powerful: belief. The soldiers who survived Stalingrad, who crawled out of those bunkers and ruins, carried not just rifles, but momentum. They had stared into the abyss and endured. Now they would march, not just to liberate, but to conquer. From Stalingrad began the long, bloody road to Berlin. The cracks in the Nazi facade. The psychological impact on German troops and civilians was profound. For the first time, people in Berlin and Munich began to question the propaganda. How could they lose so many men? How could the mighty Wehrmacht fall silent in a city no one had heard of 2 years before? Mothers wept over letters that never came. Soldiers at the front spoke in whispers of Stalingrad as a curse. The myth of unstoppable German dominance had shattered, not in speeches, but in ice-covered corpses lining the Volga. And though Hitler raged and Goebbels doubled down on speeches of total war, something vital had cracked: faith. A new Soviet identity forged in fire. Within the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became mythology. The trauma was real: millions dead, cities destroyed, an entire generation maimed. But Stalingrad gave Stalin something invaluable: a symbol. The great patriotic war narrative began here in earnest. The idea that Russia had stood alone against fascism, that ordinary workers, soldiers, mothers, and children had defended the soul of the nation against darkness. In Volgograd today, the legacy rises from the ground in the form of the colossal Motherland Calls statue, sword raised high, wind-swept robes echoing ancient gods of vengeance. Beneath her, thousands of Soviet soldiers rest in mass graves, and eternal flames burn for names both known and forgotten. The battle was immortalized in Soviet cinema, literature, school books, and later, Western films and novels too. It became not just history, but memory, passed from father to son, mother to daughter, like a scar worn with grim pride. And what does it mean now? Decades later, Stalingrad still speaks, not in glory, but in warning. In a world of modern warfare, drones, missiles, satellite strikes, it reminds us that war is not clean. It is not surgical. It is brutal, personal, and dehumanizing. Stalingrad teaches that a city is more than buildings. It is people, memories, dreams. And when you fight street to street, brick to brick, you are not conquering land. You are extinguishing lives. In every modern conflict, whether in ruined Middle Eastern cities, shelled Ukrainian towns, or forgotten corners of civil war, we see echoes of Stalingrad. We see the cost of pride, the price of ideology, and the danger of believing any war can be won without losing something essential in the process. A graveyard and a mirror. Stalingrad did not end the war, but it ended the illusion for both sides that this war would be short or that its victors would remain untouched. And in doing so, it left behind more than ruins. It left behind a question. What truly is victory when you have to bury 1 million souls to reach it? And that winter never truly ended in the mind of the soldier. The guns fell silent, but the silence did not bring peace, only echoes. Stalingrad was not the largest battle in history, but it was the most personal, the most punishing, the most symbolic. It began with precision and ambition. Operation Blau, German maps marked with arrows slicing toward the Volga. It ended in a city no longer recognizable, buried under snow, ash, and the weight of 2 broken armies. From August 1942 to February 1943, over 2 million human beings were consumed in that frozen crucible. Soldiers from Germany, the Soviet Union, Romania, Italy, Hungary. Civilians, children, nurses, priests, engineers. No one was spared. No one walked away unchanged. The final scenes in those final days. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was reduced to scattered pockets of shivering men, crouched in cellars, clutching rifles they no longer had the strength to lift. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered, not with a flourish but with a whisper. He had just been promoted by Hitler, perhaps as a trap. No German field marshal had ever been taken alive, and yet Paulus did not kill himself. He gave himself up, quietly, tired. 2 days later, the northern pocket collapsed. The battle was over. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was shock. Snow muffled the sounds of boots trudging through the ruins, of groans from wounded men, of weeping over mass graves. No music, no flags, no victory parades, only stillness, victory, or substitution. Stalingrad is remembered today as the turning point of World War II, the moment when the Nazi tide receded and the Soviet juggernaut began its march westward. But with hindsight, we must ask, was it the triumph of justice, or merely the exchange of one brutal vision for another? The Nazis fell, yes, but in their place rose a Soviet empire hardened by blood and paranoia, carving its way across Eastern Europe, planting flags and ideologies. Did Stalingrad give birth to peace, or only pause the nightmare for a few decades? Did it redeem the world, or merely remind us what humanity is capable of when ideology outruns compassion? The unfinished chapter. Ask a Russian veteran what he remembers most. He may speak of fire and brothers lost. Ask a German survivor. He may speak of snow and silence. Ask a historian, and he may speak of geopolitics, strategy, borders. But ask the ruins of Stalingrad, and they will tell you a different story. Not in words, but in what's missing. The lives, the futures, the possibilities. That is Stalingrad's real legacy, a hole in time that can never be filled. Look deeper. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Read the memoirs of Soviet snipers who fought floor by floor. Watch the interviews with German soldiers who walked home barefoot. See the photos taken by Red Army medics in frozen hospitals. Listen to the silence of Volgograd today and hear what it still holds. Because Stalingrad was not just a place, it was a warning, a wound, a mirror,